Harold Bennett sat in his favorite wooden rocking chair on his front porch, watching the early morning sun peek over the distant hills. At 93 years old, his body might have been slower, but his mind remained as sharp as the day he served in World War II. The small house on Cedar Street had been his home for over 5 decades, and every crack in the sidewalk, every flower in his garden held a precious memory. Every morning, Harold followed the same routine he had kept since Martha, his wife of 65 years, passed away 2 years ago. He would wake up at exactly 6 o'clock a.m., put on his neatly pressed khaki pants and a clean button-down shirt, and make his way to the porch with a cup of black coffee. His neighbors often wondered how he managed to look so put together at his age. The old veteran took special pride in his garden. The roses, in particular, were his pride and joy, or rather, they had been Martha's. She had planted the first bushes when they bought the house in 1971, and Harold had promised her on her deathbed that he would keep them blooming. Each morning, he would carefully water them, remove any dead leaves, and talk to them softly, just as Martha used to do. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," called Sarah, the young mail carrier, as she walked up his neatly kept pathway. She had been delivering mail on his route for the past year and always took a moment to check on him. "Morning, Sarah," Harold replied with a warm smile, slowly standing up from his chair. "Any interesting news today?" "Just the usual bills and your military pension check," she said, handing him the small stack of envelopes. "Those roses are looking beautiful today." Harold beamed with pride. Martha would have been pleased. "Would you like a cutting to plant in your own garden?" Sarah's face lit up. "Really? That would be wonderful." After Sarah left, Harold made his way inside to prepare for the second part of his daily routine, breakfast at Joe's Diner. He carefully combed his thin white hair, put on his favorite navy blue sweater, another gift from Martha, and picked up his wooden walking cane. The walk to Joe's was exactly 4 blocks, and Harold knew every crack in the sidewalk, every tree, and every house along the way. Mrs. Rodriguez would always be watering her plants when he passed, and they would exchange friendly waves. The Thompson kids would be waiting for their school bus, and they never failed to greet the war hero with enthusiasm. At Joe's Diner, Harold had his own special seat, the third booth from the door, where the morning sun would warm his back while he ate his usual breakfast of 2 scrambled eggs, whole wheat toast, and a side of crispy bacon. "Here you go, Harold," said Betty, the waitress who had been serving him for the past 15 years. She didn't even need to take his order anymore. "Extra crispy bacon, just how you like it." As Harold ate his breakfast, he watched the town come to life through the diner's large windows. Pine Grove wasn't a big town, but it was his town. He had watched it grow from a tiny farming community into a modest suburban area. The faces had changed over the years, but the friendly small-town spirit remained the same. Young Joe Jr., who now ran the diner his father had started, came over to Harold's table. "How's everything tasting today, Mr. Bennett?" "Perfect as always, Joe. Your father would be proud of how you're running the place." After finishing his breakfast, Harold took his time walking back home. He stopped to rest on the bench in front of the old courthouse, where he often sat to watch people go about their daily lives. Young mothers pushing strollers, business people hurrying to work, and children skipping to school. All of them would smile and greet him as they passed. Back at home, Harold spent the rest of his morning tending to his garden. His movements were slow but precise, each action carefully thought out to conserve his energy. The peaceful neighborhood, the familiar routine, and the gentle work in his garden made every day feel complete. Little did Harold know that this peaceful life he had built for himself was about to face an unexpected challenge, one that would test his courage and resilience in ways he hadn't experienced since his days in uniform. The first sign of trouble came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Harold was trimming his rose bushes when the ground beneath his feet began to vibrate. The sound of roaring motorcycles filled the peaceful street as 5 large bikes pulled up to the old warehouse across from his house. The riders, dressed in black leather jackets covered in patches, circled the building before parking. Harold watched as a tall man with a thick beard stepped off his motorcycle. The man must have been at least 6.5 feet tall, with arms covered in tattoos. His leather vest had a patch that read Crusher across the back. The other bikers seemed to follow his lead as he walked around the abandoned warehouse, pointing at different areas and nodding. The next morning, Harold woke up to the sound of construction. Large trucks were parked outside the warehouse, and workers were putting up new signs. A bright red banner read Road Raiders MC Clubhouse. The peaceful atmosphere of Cedar Street was suddenly filled with the noise of power tools and shouting workers. "Can you believe this?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked Harold as she hurried across the street to his porch. "They say a motorcycle club bought the old warehouse. What's going to happen to our quiet neighborhood?" Harold tried to remain positive. "Maybe they're just regular folks who enjoy riding motorcycles," he said, but deep down, he felt uneasy about the change. Within a week, the warehouse had been completely transformed. The old gray walls were now painted black with red flames. The parking lot was filled with motorcycles at all hours, and loud music played well into the night. Many neighbors started keeping their children inside, and the friendly waves Harold used to receive on his morning walks became nervous glances. One evening, as Harold sat on his porch, he noticed several bikers watching him from across the street. They were pointing and laughing, making him feel uncomfortable in his own home for the first time in 50 years. When he got up to go inside, one of them shouted, "Better watch yourself, old-timer." The next morning, Harold found his mailbox knocked over. Sarah, the mail carrier, helped him pick up the scattered letters. "Mr. Bennett, this isn't right," she said with concern in her voice. "Should we call the police?" "Not yet, Sarah," Harold replied, straightening his back despite the ache. "Let's not jump to conclusions." But things only got worse. More neighbors began moving away, selling their houses for much less than they were worth just to escape the growing tension. The street that had once been filled with children playing and families walking their dogs became eerily quiet except for the constant rumble of motorcycles. Harold's grandson, Tommy, visited one afternoon, worried about the changes in the neighborhood. "Grandpa, you can't stay here anymore," he pleaded. "Come live with us, we have plenty of room, and the kids would love having you around." Harold shook his head firmly. "This is my home, Tommy. Your grandmother and I built our life here. I'm not leaving because of a few troublemakers." That evening, as Harold watered his roses, 3 bikers walked onto his property. Crusher, their leader, towered over Harold as he approached. "Nice flowers you got here, old man," Crusher said, his voice deep and threatening. One of his friends kicked over a potted plant, sending dirt spreading across the pathway. Harold's hands shook slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I'd appreciate it if you'd leave my property." The bikers laughed. "Or what?" Crusher asked, stepping closer. "What's an ancient relic like you gonna do about it?" Harold looked directly into Crusher's eyes. "I survived World War II, son. I faced worse than a few men trying to act tough." Something in Harold's calm demeanor made Crusher step back slightly. Without another word, the bikers turned and left, but Harold knew this wasn't the end. As he cleaned up the spilled dirt and carefully replanted the knocked-over flowers, he realized that for the first time since the war, he would have to prepare for a different kind of battle, one to protect everything he held dear. The following week brought changes that Harold had never expected to face in his golden years. His morning walks to Joe's diner became a test of courage. Every time he passed the motorcycle clubhouse, someone would rev their engine loudly or shout comments that made his hands grip his walking cane tighter. One morning, Betty at the diner noticed Harold's hands shaking as she poured his coffee. "Are those horrible men bothering you again?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "Nothing I can't handle," Harold replied, trying to smile. But both of them knew things were getting serious. Young Joe Jr. came over to Harold's table, pulling up a chair. "Mr. Bennett, my father always said you were the bravest man he knew in the service. But there's no shame in asking for help. Should I call the police?" Harold stirred his coffee slowly. "The police have already been here 3 times this week. They drive by, talk to the bikers, and nothing changes. These men know exactly how far they can push without breaking any serious laws." Later that day, Harold found spray paint on his front fence. Bright red letters spelled out "Old Man Go Home Me." As he was trying to clean it off, Crusher and his gang rode past on their motorcycles, circling back several times while laughing. Sarah, the mail carrier, started bringing Harold's mail directly to his door instead of leaving it in the mailbox. "I'm worried about you, Mr. Bennett," she said one morning. "Yesterday, I saw them following my mail truck, waiting for me to deliver your mail. They're trying to isolate you." Harold's grandson Tommy visited more frequently now, often bringing groceries so his grandfather wouldn't have to walk past the clubhouse. During one visit, he found Harold looking through old photographs in a dusty box. "What are these, Grandpa?" Tommy asked, picking up a faded picture of a young Harold in his military uniform. "Just some memories," Harold replied, carefully arranging the photos on his dining room table. "You know, Tommy, back in the war, we learned that sometimes the biggest battles are won without firing a single shot." That evening, things took a turn for the worse. Harold was watching television when he heard crashes coming from his front yard. Looking through the window, he saw 3 bikers in his garden. They were pulling up his rose bushes, Martha's roses, throwing them onto the ground and stomping on them. Harold's hands began to shake, not from fear this time, but from anger. Those roses were his last living connection to Martha. Each bush held memories of her smile, her gentle touch as she pruned them, her joy when they bloomed each spring. He opened his front door and stepped onto the porch. "Stop that right now," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of his military years. Crusher turned around, grinning. "Or what, old-timer? Going to hit us with your cane?" "You boys think you're tough," Harold said, his voice steady and clear in the evening air. "But you're just bullies picking on an old man and destroying a dead woman's flowers. Is that what makes you feel strong?" For a moment, something like shame flickered across one of the younger bikers' faces, but Crusher quickly stepped forward. "We own this street now, old man. Tomorrow, we're having a big party. Hundreds of bikers coming from all over. Might get real noisy. Might be dangerous for someone your age. Maybe it's time to move somewhere quieter." Harold stood straighter, his 93-year-old frame somehow seeming taller. "I've made my decision about moving. Have you boys made yours?" "What's that supposed to mean?" Crusher demanded. "You'll find out soon enough," Harold replied, turning to go back inside. As he closed his door, he could hear them laughing, but there was an edge of uncertainty in their voices now. That night, Harold didn't sleep. Instead, he went down to his basement and opened an old trunk he hadn't touched in decades. Inside were papers, documents, and files from his military service. As he sorted through them under the dim light, a plan began to form in his mind. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, he would make his stand. The basement light burned well into the early morning hours as Harold worked methodically at his old wooden desk. Around him, scattered papers told the story of his military service, deployment orders, commendations, and most importantly, documents about the very land his house and the warehouse stood on. His arthritic fingers traced over yellowed maps, showing the original military installation that had existed here before Pine Grove expanded into a suburban town. Harold had served as a records keeper during his last years in the service, and his attention to detail hadn't faded with age. "Everything has a paper trail," he muttered to himself, something he'd often told young soldiers under his command. "You just have to know where to look." At 3 a.m., the sound of motorcycles roaring down Cedar Street broke his concentration. The bikers were returning from a bar, their loud voices carrying through his basement window. Harold heard them laughing about the destroyed rose garden. "Did you see his face when we ripped out those stupid flowers?" One voice said. "Tomorrow's party will really shake him up," another replied. "Old man won't last a week." Harold's hands clenched around the papers he was holding, but then he relaxed them carefully. Martha's voice seemed to whisper in his memory. "Patience, dear. Anger clouds the mind." He reached for an old military trunk in the corner and opened it with reverence. Inside lay his dress uniform, still perfectly pressed after all these years. He ran his fingers over the medals, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and others that told the story of his service. The uniform still fit. He made sure of that by trying it on every Veterans Day. As dawn approached, Harold organized his findings into a neat folder. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He began doing stretching exercises he learned in the service. His joints protested, but he pressed on. Tomorrow would require stamina. When Sarah arrived with the mail, she found Harold sitting on his porch as usual, but something was different. He seemed calmer, more focused. "Mr. Bennett," she said hesitantly, "there are so many motorcycles arriving at the warehouse. Maybe you should stay inside today?" Harold smiled gently. "Don't worry about me, Sarah. Would you do me a favor, though? Could you give this envelope to your supervisor at the post office?" He handed her an official-looking letter. "It's important that it gets filed today." By noon, the street was filled with motorcycles. Music blasted from huge speakers set up outside the warehouse. bikers wandered across Harold's lawn, deliberately stepping on what remained of his garden. Some made threatening gestures toward his house. Inside, Harold methodically got ready. He showered and shaved with extra care. Then he opened his closet and took out his freshly pressed dress uniform. Each metal was polished to perfection. He put on the uniform slowly, making sure everything was exactly according to regulations. His grandson Tommy arrived, panicked by the scene outside. "Grandpa, we need to get you out of here. There must be 100 bikers out there." Harold straightened his tie in the mirror. "Tommy, did I ever tell you about the time I faced an entire German unit with just 3 men in my squad? But that was different. You were young then." "Age," Harold said, pinning his last medal in place, "has taught me that not all battles are won with fists or weapons. Sometimes the strongest weapon is right here." He tapped his temple. Tommy watched in amazement as his grandfather transformed before his eyes. Despite his 93 years, Harold stood straight and tall in his uniform, his medals catching the afternoon light. He picked up the folder he prepared during the night and tucked it under his arm. "What are you going to do?" Tommy asked nervously. Harold checked his appearance one final time in the mirror. "I'm going to teach these boys a lesson about respect, history, and the mistake of underestimating old soldiers." With that, Harold Bennett opened his front door, ready to face the crowd of bikers gathering outside. The time for being a victim was over. Now it was time to show them exactly who they were dealing with. The moment Harold stepped onto his front porch in his full military dress uniform, a hush fell over the crowd of bikers. His medals gleamed in the afternoon sun, and despite his age, his posture was perfectly straight. Even from a distance, there was something commanding about his presence that made several bikers lower their music. Tommy watched nervously from the doorway as his grandfather slowly descended the porch steps. The folder tucked under Harold's arm contained what he'd spent all night preparing, but to Tommy, it seemed like a flimsy defense against the sea of leather-clad bikers. Crusher emerged from the warehouse, pushing through the crowd. "Well, look who's playing dress-up," he shouted, causing some bikers to laugh. But their laughter sounded uncertain, less confident than before. Harold walked steadily toward the warehouse, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. Each step was deliberate, measured, just as they had been during his military parades. Some of the older bikers unconsciously straightened their postures as he passed. "You're interrupting our party, old man," Crusher said, towering over Harold. "Nice costume, but it won't help you here." Harold looked up at Crusher, his eyes sharp and clear. "Son, I'm not here for your party. I'm here to talk business." His voice carried across the suddenly quiet street. "Shall we step into your office, or would you prefer I share this information with everyone present?" Something in Harold's tone made Crusher hesitate. He glanced at the folder under Harold's arm, then at his fellow bikers watching the scene unfold. "Fine. Inside. But make it quick." As Harold followed Crusher into the warehouse, 2 other high-ranking bikers joined them. The room they entered was set up as a makeshift office, with a desk covered in beer cans and motorcycle magazines. Harold remained standing, ramrod straight. "Before I begin, I should introduce myself properly. Master Sergeant Harold Bennett, United States Army, serial number 14,589,632, formerly stationed at Installation 47B, which is exactly where we're standing right now." Crusher's face showed confusion. "What are you talking about, old man?" Harold opened his folder and laid out several official-looking documents on the desk. "This warehouse sits on what was once a military supply depot. When the Army sold the land in 1962, certain provisions were included in the property deed. Provisions that were never rescinded." He pulled out a highlighted document. According to Federal Code 47.3b, any property previously used for military purposes remains subject to immediate federal jurisdiction if evidence of illegal activities is found. The color drained from Crusher's face as Harold continued laying out papers. "I've spent the last 2 months documenting every illegal transaction, every drug deal, every stolen part that's passed through this warehouse. The FBI has quite an interest in motorcycle clubs that operate as fronts for criminal enterprises." "You're bluffing," one of the other bikers said, but his voice wavered. Harold pulled out one final document. "This morning, I filed an official request for federal investigation through channels that never quite closed down. By tomorrow morning, This entire block will be swarming with federal agents. Unless. Unless what? Crusher demanded, his tough facade cracking. Unless we make a deal, Harold said, standing even straighter. I have an alternative proposal that might interest you. The room fell silent. Through the windows, they could see hundreds of bikers milling around, waiting to see what would happen. Harold's medals caught the light as he shifted, reminding everyone present of exactly who they were dealing with. I'm listening, Crusher said finally, slumping into his chair. Harold allowed himself a small smile, remembering something his commanding officer had said long ago. Sometimes the greatest victory is the battle you prevent. He reached into his folder for one final document, his proposal that would change everything. Outside, Tommy and the gathered bikers waited in tense silence, having no idea that the future of Cedar Street was being decided by an old soldier who had learned long ago that true strength isn't about muscles or intimidation. It's about strategy, wisdom, and the courage to stand up for what's right. Inside the warehouse office, Harold stood before Crusher and his lieutenants, holding the final document in his steady hands. The tension in the room could be cut with a knife as he began to speak. Before I show you my proposal, Harold said, I'd like you to look at something. He pulled out an old photograph from his uniform pocket and placed it on the desk. The image showed a young soldier standing beside a military motorcycle, grinning proudly at the camera. That was me, 1944, serving as a motorcycle messenger in Europe, Harold explained. We rode through enemy territory, delivering critical information when radio silence was necessary. Those bikes saved countless lives. Crusher picked up the photo, studying it carefully. For the first time, his tough expression softened slightly. My grandfather was a motorcycle messenger in the Pacific Theater, he said quietly. Harold nodded, then looked directly at Crusher. Now, show me your arm, the one you always keep covered with your jacket. The room grew silent. Slowly, Crusher removed his leather jacket. There on his right forearm was a familiar tattoo, the insignia of the U.S. Marine Corps. Afghanistan, 2010 to 2015, Crusher said, his voice different now. Lost my best friend there. Came back, different. Started riding to feel something, anything. Found these guys. He gestured to his fellow bikers. Harold laid his proposal on the desk. This is why I'm offering you a choice. This building, with its history as a military installation, could become something meaningful. A veterans support center run by your motorcycle club. The other bikers leaned forward as Harold continued. Many veterans find peace on the open road on their bikes, but they also need a place to belong to be understood. This location, with its federal connections, would qualify for veteran support grants. Instead of running from the law, you could work with it. Crusher ran his hand over his beard, thinking. And what about our current activities? End them, Harold said firmly. Replace them with legitimate business. Motorcycle repair, rider training, support meetings. Help other veterans find their way back, just like motorcycles helped you. One of the other bikers spoke up. But our reputation will change, Harold finished. From outlaws to guardians, from troublemakers to community leaders. It's a better legacy, don't you think? Crusher stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the crowd of bikers in the parking lot. Some won't like this change. Then they can leave, Harold said. Keep the ones who understand what it means to serve something bigger than themselves. A long moment passed. Then Crusher turned back, extending his hand to Harold. You know, when we moved in, we thought you were just some weak old man. We were wrong. Harold shook his hand firmly. Age doesn't weaken the warrior spirit, son. It just teaches us to fight smarter battles. As they walked out of the office together, the crowd outside grew quiet again. Crusher raised his hands for attention. Listen up. There's going to be some changes around here. Over the next hour, Crusher explained the new direction to his fellow bikers. Some left in anger, revving their engines in protest. But more stayed, especially after Harold shared more stories about military motorcycle units and their proud history. By evening, something remarkable had happened. The same bikers who had destroyed Harold's garden were now helping him replant his roses. Tommy watched in amazement as tough-looking men in leather carefully handled the delicate plants, following Harold's gentle instructions. My wife Martha, Harold told them as they worked, always said that gardens and people need the same things to grow: care, patience, and someone who believes in them. As the sun set on Cedar Street, the sound of motorcycles could still be heard, but it was different now. Instead of threatening rumbles, they were more like distant thunder, powerful but protective, a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected changes bring the greatest blessings. Sarah, the mail carrier, stopped by after her route, stunned by the transformation. "Mr. Bennett," she whispered, "how did you do it?" Harold smiled, watching Crusher teach some younger bikers the proper way to prune a rose bush. "Sometimes, my dear, the best way to defeat an enemy is to turn them into a friend." The changes on Cedar Street happened faster than anyone expected. Within a week, the black walls of the warehouse were repainted a dignified navy blue. The red flames were replaced by a new sign reading Veterans Victory Motorcycle Club, serving those who served. Harold found himself busier than he'd been in years. Every morning, after his usual breakfast at Joe's Diner, he would walk to the warehouse. Now, instead of taunts and revving engines, he was greeted with respectful nods and friendly waves. One morning, Crusher, whose real name, Harold learned, was James Cooper, was waiting for him outside the diner. "Mind if I join you for breakfast, Sergeant?" James asked, looking quite different in a clean white t-shirt instead of his leather jacket. Over eggs and coffee, James shared his story. "After my third tour in Afghanistan, I couldn't sleep. Couldn't hold a job. The only peace I found was on my bike." He stirred his coffee slowly. "Found some guys who understood. We took a wrong turn somewhere. Became what we used to fight against." Harold listened carefully, remembering his own difficult days after World War II. "The hardest wars," he said, "are the ones we fight inside ourselves." Word spread quickly through veteran networks about the changes at the motorcycle club. Veterans from neighboring towns started showing up, some on bikes, others just looking for a place to belong. The warehouse's main room was transformed into a meeting space, with comfortable chairs arranged in circles for support group sessions. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had once been terrified of the bikers, now brought homemade cookies to their weekly meetings. "My son served in Iraq," she told Harold. "I wish there had been a place like this when he came home." The local police, who used to drive by regularly expecting trouble, now stopped in for coffee. Officer Jenkins, a former Marine himself, started leading group discussions about transitioning back to civilian life. One afternoon, Harold watched from his porch as James taught a young veteran how to repair a motorcycle engine. The young man's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from what Harold recognized as post-traumatic stress. James worked patiently with him, talking softly about engines and parts until the shaking subsided. "You know," James said later, joining Harold on the porch, "we're getting more requests for help than we can handle. Veterans from 3 counties want to join our program." Harold smiled. "Then we'll need to expand. Remember those federal grants I mentioned?" Together, they began working on proposals. Harold's experience with military documentation proved invaluable, while James's connections in the veteran community helped identify the most pressing needs. The Rose Garden became a special place of healing. Harold taught interested veterans about gardening, finding that working with plants helped calm troubled minds. Martha always said, he would tell them, that you can't rush a garden, everything grows in its own time. One evening, as the sun set over Cedar Street, Tommy visited his grandfather and found the porch filled with people. Harold sat in his rocking chair, surrounded by veterans both young and old, sharing stories about their service. "And there we were," Harold was saying. "Our motorcycle broke down behind enemy lines. But you know what saved us? Basic maintenance skills. That's why we're starting a motorcycle repair training program here." James nodded. "Teaching practical skills gives people purpose. Plus, it helps them find good jobs." Tommy watched in amazement as these former troublemakers hung on every word his grandfather spoke. The respect in their eyes was genuine, the transformation real. Later that night, after everyone had left, Tommy helped Harold inside. "Grandpa, did you plan all this? Did you know the bikers would change like this?" Harold smiled, looking out his window at the warehouse, now a beacon of hope for troubled veterans. "Sometimes, Tommy, the best plans are the ones that leave room for people to surprise you. Those boys didn't need to be fought. They needed to be reminded of who they really were." As Harold prepared for bed, he heard the distant sound of motorcycles. But now, instead of feeling fear, he felt pride. The rumble of engines had become a symphony of healing, a reminder that it's never too late for change, and that sometimes the most unlikely situations bring out the best in people. 6 months had passed since the day Harold had walked into the warehouse in his military uniform. Cedar Street had become a different place, not quieter, but filled with purposeful activity and respect. One sunny morning, Harold sat in his usual spot at Joe's diner, but he wasn't alone. The booth was crowded with James Crusher Cooper and 3 other veteran bikers, all studying papers spread across the table. The federal grant came through, James announced, pointing to an official letter. We can expand the support center to the empty lot next door. More classroom space for job training and a bigger garage for motorcycle repair classes. Betty, the waitress, brought extra coffee without being asked. You boys are making us proud, she said, smiling at the transformation she witnessed over the past months. The motorcycle club had become a model for other communities. News reporters often visited Cedar Street, amazed by the story of how a 93-year-old veteran had transformed a troubled biker gang into a veterans support network. Harold always redirected their attention to the good work being done, not the past troubles. That afternoon, Harold watched from his garden as a group of new veterans arrived at the center. James greeted them with the same respect he once reserved for fellow gang members. Through the open warehouse doors, Harold could see the newly installed computers for job searches, the counseling rooms, and the workshop where veterans learned motorcycle maintenance. Mr. Bennett, called a familiar voice. Sarah, the mail carrier, walked up his path with a special envelope. This came from the governor's office. Harold opened the letter slowly, his eyes widening as he read. The Veterans Victory Motorcycle Club was being recognized with a state award for community service. But what touched him most was the personal note at the bottom, mentioning how their program was being studied as a model for other cities. Later that day, during the center's weekly community dinner, James stood up to make an announcement. The room was packed with veterans, local residents, and even some police officers who had become regular visitors. Thanks to Master Sergeant Bennett, James said, his voice carrying across the room, we found our way back to who we were meant to be. Today, we're not just helping veterans, we're becoming the people our younger selves would have been proud of. Harold looked around the room, remembering how it had looked 6 months ago. Where there had been angry bikers, there were now mentors. Where there had been fear, there was now friendship. His eyes fell on his rose garden, visible through the window, now tended by many hands. Mrs. Rodriguez stood up next. I used to be scared to walk past this building, she admitted. Now, I tell everyone how blessed we are to have it in our neighborhood. My son found healing here that he couldn't find anywhere else. As the evening wound down, Tommy arrived to check on his grandfather. He found Harold sitting on his porch, surrounded by veteran bikers who were listening to one of his war stories. The thing about courage, Harold was saying, is that it comes in many forms. Sometimes it's charging into battle, but more often, it's having the strength to change, to help others, to become better than you were yesterday. James nodded, then noticed something. Hey, Sarge, your roses are blooming again. Indeed, Martha's roses had flourished under the care of many hands. Their sweet fragrance filled the evening air, a testament to patience, care, and the power of transformation. As the sun set on Cedar Street, the sound of motorcycles could still be heard. But now they were the sounds of hope, veterans arriving for support meetings, mentors heading home after teaching classes, and transformed lives moving forward with purpose. Harold looked out at his beloved street, at the warehouse that had become a beacon of hope, at the bikers who had become protectors, and at the community that had learned to see past appearances to the hearts beneath. Martha would have loved this, he whispered to himself, touching one of her roses gently. Sometimes the best gardens are the ones we plant in other people's hearts. And so, the story of the 93-year-old veteran who stood up to the bikers became something more, a testament to the fact that it's never too late for change, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through confrontation, but through understanding and compassion.